Hello, and welcome to this special edition of Religion and Life. In the wake of George Floyd's death on May 25th, our community, our nation, and indeed our world has been reawakened to the reality of racism, violence, hate, and injustice in the world. As protesters walk in Boone and across our nation to raise awareness, questions are often raised about where we go from here. How do we channel our outrage into meaningful change? How do we deal with embedded racism within our society? My guests today are going to help us address these questions and try to imagine how we might forge a path towards a just society. Welcome, Cara and Reggie. Thank you for joining us. And let me take a moment just to introduce you properly. Cara Hagan is Associate Professor in the Department of Theater and Dance here at Appalachian State University, and also a community leader and founder of a local advocacy group called Small and Mighty Acts. And Reggie Hunt, who's been on our program in the past, is a third-generation minister, currently pastor of Cornerstone Summit Church in Boone, and Director of Leadership Development and Athlete Development at Appalachian State University. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Since this program is called Religion in Life, let me start with Reggie as a representative of one of our religious communities here in Boone. Reggie, recently you posted a sermon in which, in large part, you were reading from a sermon that your grandfather wrote and delivered in 1963 after the Birmingham church bombings. It was beautifully done in a poignant moment. And I'd like for you, if you don't mind, just to comment on what led you to that sermon and how that sermon ties into some of the recent unrest we've been experiencing in light of the George Floyd's death.
Thank you, Dr. Oz. Glad to be on here. You know, as you said, I'm a third generation pastor, and I was blessed with the notes and the sermons from my grandfather's messages, really from the 1950s all the way through 83 when he passed. And seeing some of those messages, the message after the Sunday after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Sunday after JFK was assassinated, these different historical events, and to be able to read them and hear almost as if they were written last week. Some of those sermons I've sat on for a while, but when I was reading through just after the Birmingham 16th Avenue Baptist Church was bombed, it seemed to speak to me a little bit more of some real essentials. One of the things that he speaks about is not only equality of access, but equality of power, the essential life of every person created in the image of God. And that's really what kind of drew my attention. And honestly, I was encouraged to kind of go to those messages because I was pretty devastated by the recent events of George Floyd. And I was really talking to a mentor as I was in tears, and he said, "This is a great time to lead. You know, as painful as it is, it's a great time to lead. And what can you draw from?" So I drew from those messages. Those messages also reminded me that over time, there have been things systemically that theologians have endorsed from the pulpit that the culture early on accepted because it was accepted theologically. So even going back to slavery, these are things I learned in my grandfather's notes. Even going back to slavery, something that was predicated upon the basis of kidnapping, and kidnapping was considered capital crime in the Bible. But since slavery was endorsed theologically, it was accepted culturally. Then we moved through some of these pieces through Jim Crow laws and separate but equal, and we still have separate but equal in a lot of ways. So I was reading my grandfather's messages of this separate but equal mindset that was happening in the 60s, and this challenge for there to be a biblical response to the injustice. And then also recognizing that there's still a lot of separate but equal perspectives, foundations in our current church systems.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I evolved with those notes.
So what I heard you say, a couple of things, is number one, that religion in our culture can operate in order to, I guess, undergird social injustice in some ways, providing theological justifications
Right.
For certain things that are accepted in the mainstream of society, but also that religion can provide a type of prophetic voice to speak out against those injustices. And I'm hearing you say that this is the time for leadership to embrace that kind of prophetic aspect of the theological message. Am I overstating that, or is that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that this is the time to lead. This is the time for prophetic voices to come forward, and I think that there is a lot of biblical foundation to this, rather than being distracted by what I would consider to be extremes. I think that there's a solid and sound biblical foundation for leaders to speak to the injustice and lead in a process of closing the gap and reconciling and bringing justice where there is injustice.
Well, I want to come back to that, Reggie, and maybe have you expound a little bit on these biblical and theological concepts that address this current situation. But I want to move to Cara at this point, because I think one of the things that I've seen in recent local protests and walks is a kind of a collaborative effort, not with religious organizations, Reggie, but also civic and political organizations as well. And Cara has been active in our community in that way. So Cara, maybe you could comment a little bit on your organization, Small and Mighty Acts, the sort of work that you've been doing in the wake of the George Floyd unrest, but also the sort of work you would like to do beyond that in response to social inequality and social justice.
Yeah, so I'll say first, just for myself, these have been issues that I've been working on my whole life, and certainly in an active way my entire adult life. And when Small and Mighty Acts came to be, it was because I wanted to help other people to cultivate what I call a civic practice, and something where I tell my students, where you can touch the work every day, whatever that means for you, whatever that looks like, whether it be educating yourself, collaborating with people, staging actions and events, whatever that may be. And I think now in this moment, we're seeing what we could characterize as a resurgence, for lack of a better term, of the civil rights movement. Now, because we've had this strange confluence of the pandemic, which has had a lot of people home, and the police violence, the state-sanctioned violence that has never gone away, that has never not been a part of our experience of this country, that now we have this renewed visibility. Again, the movement never went away. The movement for Black Lives has been doing the work, even though it's gone a little underground before this point. And I think that George Floyd's death, because it was so gruesome and because so many people saw it, really helped people to spring to action. Of course, this is not the first time we've seen somebody murdered on camera, right? This is the digital age. We see this often enough. But I think that there was something about this one where the people involved, of course, it was long, and the violence was done with one's own body, not necessarily a weapon, where we've seen a lot of shootings on screen. And I think that for the Black community especially, this was like, wow, this one really hurt. They all hurt, but this one really hurt. And so I think that with this energy that people are feeling, the zeitgeist of what's happening right now, people are wanting to co-create. I mean, coming from the arts world, as I do, not just as a civic leader, but as an artist, an active artist, I think that we have to remember that when we come to something like a protest, This is, yes, it's action, it's co-creation, it's ritual, where I always like to remind people that ritual is a balm for the soul, and it's resistance, right? So these things carry a couple of different meanings and a couple of different ways that they work in the world. And so small and mighty acts, ultimately, where we might do something like the altar that we put on King Street, where people could co-create and have a place to grieve and to meditate and to pray, that this type of civic practice is pulling from all these different pieces and parts of us, from that piece where we draw our spirituality, from that piece where we draw our creativity, from that piece where we draw our practices of civics and practice of resistance.
What's very interesting that I was just listening to some of the words you were using, which have a kind of spiritual grounding or theological grounding even, creation, altar, ritual, meditation, prayer. Tell me a little bit about the altar you created on King Street. And this was a Small and Mighty Acts work, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes. So through Small and Mighty Acts, we set up an altar that we invited the community to add to throughout the course of a week. And so it started with a couple of objects and pieces of art, and over the week it grew and expanded, and it expanded and it breathed, and it became what it wanted to become. And so in that, people can start having conversations around, well, why would we have an altar in the first place? Why would we need a place for people to come grieve somebody that they don't even know, or a collection of people that they don't even know? Because of course, we know that there had been lots of deaths, lots of murders, one after the other, it seemed like, between the winter and the spring. And of course, before that, every other death that has happened before that, that's been a state-sanctioned death or something that was born of white vigilantism. And so this altar was a way in this pandemic state of giving people a way who wanted to respect the social distancing guidelines to still do something public and utilize some of that spectacle of organizing, where you put on a public show of something as a way of getting people talking. So the altar, in essence, did all of those things, right? It gave people space, it invited people to participate, it acted as a kind of spectacle, and it sent a message.
And I think you're right, Cara. This moment in time does seem different in many ways. I think your word was resurgence of a civil rights moment in our culture and society. I'm taken by your use of ritual. And that might bring Reggie back into the conversation here. Ritual is a kind of public act that reaches beyond ourselves in many ways. Reggie, I'm just wondering if you have a perspective on the kind of events that have been taking place in Boone in particular. We've had a couple of walks, a couple of protests downtown, which has brought together people in a kind of ritualistic expression. Just, do you have a perspective on how that's taken place in Boone and what the feeling's like, and are we moving forward through this type of ritualistic expression?
Just responding and joining in on what Cara has just said, and what Small and Mighty Acts has done with this altar and visual. I agree. I think that one of the things that we miss in a religious perspective and a faith perspective is the ability to lament. And from the very beginning, I mean, even not just George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, but oftentimes we see a community that hasn't found a space or a place to lament. And so even what we have seen, when I saw that on King Street, I was like, wow, like we have a space now. Like sometimes when I'm talking to people from other areas that maybe don't have maybe they have a lower population of minority presence, I say to them, I think that's what makes it harder for Black and brown people, is we don't always have a space. Working with student athletes, it's not something that you can always talk about in the weight room or in the locker room. So being able to have a space, a place that we can lament is important. The protests and the marches were encouraging in the sense to see that people are willing to voice, and again, to not get distracted by a lot of other things, but just seeing that many people in my time in Boone, seeing that many people come out was really encouraging. I don't know fully if it is growth yet. I do think that it is a seed that we need to water. And if we can give some partnerships and some instruction and some ways for people to move forward, then we can see change. What we are seeing now is kind of some initial steps. But I also think rather than looking at the next big step, let's look at just the next step. So I really appreciate folks who have been a part of the dialogue, and really appreciated the vigil and altar on King Street. I just thought that was phenomenal, and it was really good. Let me say this: it was really good to see that happen in Boone. Like we just don't. I mean, we at best we might see a cross and some flowers where somebody, died in a car wreck. We never really see. To have that on downtown King Street in Boone was phenomenal, and I saw that it brought people of faith and people who may not necessarily subscribe to Christianity together at one place. So that also is work.
Well, you mentioned a space, and what better space than the public square? That's really quite important. And I think it probably is important also to mention, as you did, Reggie, that Boone, for viewers who may not be familiar with Boone, Boone is a community with a small representation of minority populations. So that kind of expression of public ritual and on the public square, I think, is extremely important. And you mentioned collaborative efforts bringing people together. Cara, I'm wondering if in your work in the community with your advocacy group, are you working with other civic groups currently or in the past? What do you see there? Is this going to bring greater resources together in collaborative and cooperative efforts, I wonder?
I do hope so. I think that in the cycles that happen sociopolitically, you see groups kind of rise up, bubble to the top, and then they fall away. And so, for example, in 2016, when Small and Mighty Axe came to be, there were several other groups in town that came together as well. And some of those we had the pleasure of collaborating with, some not, but the vast majority of them are not meeting anymore. And so I think that now that we have the opportunity to have some of those groups reappear or new groups appear, certainly we're hoping to be able to do more collaborative work and to pool resources so that we can do the best work that we can do together. I think that's really important. One group in particular that we've become connected with is Black and Boone, and they're going to be doing some awesome programming and work coming up. Also, Radical Kindred is an LGBTQIA+ group in town, and they're doing some amazing work, and we're hoping to get connected with them however necessary, however possible. You know, it can be something as simple as sharing information with our group about some things that their group is doing, everything until actually co-sponsoring events, which we haven't necessarily done yet, but that certainly can happen and the opportunity is there. And knowing that Boone is such a small town and that there's overlap between groups, in that some members of one group come to meetings of another group, you know what I mean? So already there's kind of a fluid organicness about it that would lend itself to that kind of collaboration. But I think ultimately, I hope that everyone in town feels inspired to collaborate with each other in those organic ways, not just through our groups, which gives a form or a structure for people to tap into, but also in their own neighborhoods, in their school communities, you know, where their kids go to school, on our campus community, in their faith communities, whatever that may look like. We all occupy lots of different communities and we play different roles in those communities. And one thing I think is really important is to identify the particular gifts that you bring to a civic space and to find ways to use those. And in different communities, that's going to look different.
Well, I'm going to shift the conversation just a bit for a moment. The George Floyd's death and other recent events have highlighted, I think, in a way, Cara, as you said earlier, that hasn't been recently, at least, the continued existence of racism in systems, in institutions, embedded within our culture, within our society. How do we best characterize this continued ongoing racism? Is it a religious issue? Is it a moral issue? Is it a human issue? How do we describe the root causes of some of these acts of violence that we're witnessing now? And maybe if we can identify some of those root causes, we can begin to work toward solutions in different and better ways. Reggie, how would you, is this a religious issue or is it a human issue? How would you describe continued inequalities in our culture?
All of the above. I personally am not one who's really able to separate religious issues from humanity issues, because from a perspective of Christianity, I don't see how you could ever separate them. Morally, from a human issue, from a religious issue, I would say that I don't think that there's any area where we can justify silence. From a religious perspective, my constant battle is reminding people to respond biblically. What I mean by that is the wisest man in the world at the time, Solomon, writes 2 times, not 1, 2 times in Proverbs, that unjust scales and unequal weights are an abomination to the Lord. And, religious people love that word abomination, right? So I just thought, like, out of all the things that we talk about, why do we never talk about unjust scales? When I look at Ahmaud Arbery, I look at the stand your ground law as an unjust law, that we should be debating this law before this incident even, this tragedy really even happened. And I think that we have been overlooking injustice, and even moving through the New Testament, I think there's plenty of biblical grounds, whether it's the sin of partiality that James talks about, or whether it is the ministry of reconciliation that Paul writes about. I think that we have to respond, and that we have to be compassionate with the pieces of humanity. And at the same time, as a person working in athletics at Appalachian, I don't think that you can benefit from a group of people and not be concerned with what impacts those people's world. So we have asked Black and brown students to come to this university and to assimilate into dominant culture. So if I'm okay to assimilate into your culture, but you're not concerned with what terrorizes my life, that too is injustice. And so I think that from every aspect, whether it's academia, whether it's athletics, whether it's humanity or faith, that we are called to respond to injustice.
Yeah. The metaphor of unjust scales is actually a very nice one. That's a good image to bring to the discussion. Cara, how would you characterize this kind of continued embedded racism in terms of root causes?
I also think that it's a couple of things, that there are several things that contribute to it. Of course, I mean, we can talk about the history of the building of this country and the fact that this country would not have been built without racism, without institutionalized, intentional racism, and the ways that that has followed us. The residue of that is still very much there. But if we think about things like, I don't know, Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue, this was ordained, as it were, by God, as it was said by the monarchy at the time in Spain, right? And so these things are embedded in with each other, in that a lot of times, even though we theoretically have a separation of church and state, so much religious talk or vocabulary makes its way into the political discourse, right? We have our presidents of the United States swearing in on a Bible or a religious text. You know, we have on our money "In God we trust," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are many examples. So I think that in that way, we have to think about how we've used religion to further our relationship to racism and the perpetuation of it and making it okay, cherry picking words and phrases to say, well, this was okay in the Bible, so maybe it's okay for us. And I think that at the end of the day, it is a moral failing. And this is my opinion. I think that we as people, as some of the few creatures in the universe, as it were, that have, to our knowledge, free will, that because we have that power, we also have a responsibility to use that power in a way that is about radical care, a radical community care, and not the destruction of other people. And we seem to be really, 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 really good at destructing each other and not really, 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 really good at holding each other up. And if we think about, coming from a biblical context, we think about Cain and Abel, a murder, and one of many murders that we get to see in the Bible, where we get to see a glimpse of that piece of ourselves that, maybe we have a choice not to do that. Could that story have gone a different way? And if so, how? And I think that in this moment, this is our reckoning. We have a choice to say, well, is this going to go this way or is this going to go a different way? Are we going to use all of our creative tools that we've been gifted with through whatever means we believe that may have been gifted to us through? Are we going to use our creative ingenuity to forge a different path, or are we going to do the status quo and kind of lean on the some of the language that we've used before to justify it?
And Dr. Charles, can I say one thing?
Absolutely.
I wish that we would expound upon that. And we don't have time right now, but I love what Cara just said. The Cain and Abel text. To me, that brings up this piece: are we listening? Like, are we listening? And in the Cain and Abel murder, God says, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "I am I my brother's keeper." He says his blood cries from the ground, like that God in that text tells us that he hears the cries of injustice. And I just don't feel like we have been listening. We weren't, not to get off on a lot of tangents, but we weren't listening in school shootings. We thought that they had brought actors in. We weren't listening in the 60s, the 70s, the 50s. I mean, we haven't been listening for years. We weren't listening during the Me Too movement. We're not listening when we talk about sexual harassment and assault. Like, why are we so afraid of this conversation? And not just the conversation of the race, but the conversation of injustice and the voices of underrepresented and marginalized people. Why are we so afraid of listening? You got another question. I just love what she said. And that's what I've been trying to communicate on a lot of these conversations, of if we would take a moment to hear the cries of injustice. And I think Lady Justice is often depicted as a woman holding scales with blindfolds on. And I know that's so that she's not partial, but I also wonder if she needs a hearing aid so that she can hear the cries of injustice, right? So just something I've been processing. Thanks for sharing that, Cara.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a wonderful point to kind of begin to wrap up our conversation, as much as I don't want to. But I hear, Reggie, in your question about listening, and in your comments about public lament, and Cara, in your comments about a day of reckoning and bringing creative gifts to bear. I hear in all that a kind of sense of embedded hope in this moment, as well as it is a moment of despair, but also hear in those comments an element of hope. So I'm wondering if, in just a brief way, we could close out this program with what you see as hope, if there is any, at this point in time to point us forward and to point us towards moving, Reggie, as you said, toward that next small step.
Cara, you take the lead there.
Okay. I think that so many times hope has shown us the way. And while I sometimes feel like it's really hard to be hopeful, I think that it's a great tool, right? That if we didn't have hope, there would be a lot of us who are not here today for whatever reason. Things in history that have turned the tides would not have happened. Things that have happened in court, famous court decisions would not have happened if it were not for hope. And so I think that obviously in that respect, we need to keep hope alive. And I think also that when the human spirit kind of gets to that low place, if it has any hope, to use that word, of getting out, it has to have a mechanism, right? And I think for a lot of people, that mechanism looks different, but the heart of it is the same. It's that inkling that there might be some light at the end of the tunnel. It's that inkling that there might be something better if we just hold on just a little longer. It's that inkling that we can learn what we need to learn before it's too late. And we see now that I have a child, you see that kids do this really well. They're like, well, if I just do this one thing, maybe it'll be different, and they're good at trying new things. And I think that is the essence of hope, or whatever you'd like to call it, the essence of something that could be, the essence of impetus.
Yeah. Reggie?
Yeah, one quote says that hope is the sustaining energy used to accomplish faith and love. So hope is that sustaining piece. And I think that's why I reached back to some of my grandfather's sermons to be reminded of those ancestors who held on to hope and moved forward. I'm but I'm also very hopeful with partnerships. I love what I'm seeing in Boone and beyond, where people are partnering together, where we can become a part of solutions. And that's one of my goals at the beginning of this year was, from a church and personal standpoint, was to focus on partnerships. We can do a lot more when we can exchange keys, and there's some things that maybe somebody else is strong at that is not a strong suit for us, and maybe there's some other things that we're strong for. So I'm hopeful because of partnerships, and I'm hopeful because I see people willing to come to the dialogue and willing to be a part of solutions. And I think that if we can keep our focus on fertile grounds and receptive places, and not be distracted by other folks who may not be willing to change or be a part of the change, then I think we can see some transformative work.
Well, I want to thank you both. This has been a productive dialogue and conversation for me. And I thank you for taking the time to come and begin this discussion. And perhaps we could even continue this in future episodes or different formats. But I appreciate you coming on the program today. Unfortunately, we're out of time this time, but perhaps we can meet together in the future. So thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for Religion and Life for this special episode. We hope that you will join us as we all work together toward creating a just society. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwald.